All right. So thank you. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for that great talk, Chris. And I feel like now I can become part of a CFI conspiracy because Chris has given you the case, one case against reason, against motivated reasoning, and I'm going to sort of speak, I'm going to make another case against reason. And I feel like if CFI is having two speakers in a row against reason, something is really going on, something nefarious. It's just a conspiracy. Don't move along. What I want to talk about a little bit in an indirect way, I'll come around to this, is maybe, I don't have a catchy phrase like motivated reasoning, but maybe identity, reason as an identity. Reason as an identity, this is how you define yourself. So now we're not actually talking about the verb, we're talking about a noun applied to a person. But I want to start this by backing up because this is the panel is about conspiracy theories and so on, and Chris has just given this great way of understanding where these conspiracy theories on the right come from and also these great methods for debunking them. And I'm here to talk a little bit more about, to try if I can, to debunk the idea that the right wing is one vast wing conspiracy or vast conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy. It's something different. It's something more powerful. And I speak particularly in terms of the Christian right, which is where I write about. And I speak as someone who is probably inadvertently responsible for a lot of conspiracy thinking, having written 2 books about a kind of sort of shady and behind-the-scenes powerful Christian right group, and a lot of people leap to the automatic conclusion that this group is a conspiracy. It's not. That doesn't make it good. There's more than one kind of bad, but it's not a conspiracy. And I'm reminded, part of the reason it's not a conspiracy is because conspiracies are very, very difficult, and I always take heart when I think about this, when I'm researching something, reporting something, and thinking about conspiracy, from a story my father told me when I was a child. My father, his job was something that doesn't exist anymore. He was a Sovietologist. He studied the Soviet Union. He got laid off. He was a political scientist. And I remember being a kid and, worrying about what these things that Ronald Reagan said, and it was on TV, and he was our president, so it was absolutely trustworthy, about the Soviets, that they could launch this nuclear war anytime, the morning after Red Dawn and so on. And my father, whose career had started in sort of verification stuff, told me a story that I'm probably going to mangle, and with real sort of science-minded people here, you'll know that I'm fuzzing the details, but I was 8 or 9 when I heard this, so you forgive me. That a top-ranking Soviet general goes to inspect one of the real key Soviet air bases, one of the bomber bases, and are the bombs, the nuclear warheads, everything else, is it all ready to go? Yes, it's ready to go. Everything is, they can launch in a minute, except that they have a problem. They're low on fuel. And the reason they're low on fuel is that the pilot, some ingenious pilot, had discovered some way to use fuel in the distillery process of making vodka. So somehow, I don't know, scientists can tell me how if this is possible, somehow they had spent their fuel on vodka and maybe just huffing fumes, I don't know. And so they weren't going to be launching anytime soon. This is a good reminder that when we attribute conspiracies to other people, we tend to imagine greater competence than is very common. And the great consolation, I think, for those of us who sometimes worry about the power of the right is the astonishing incompetence. Now, don't go patting his wheels, but look at us. I mean, yeah, look at us. We're really on a roll now, those of us who have more progressive ideas. I think about this in terms of what's in the news right now with the Occupy movement here in Washington and New York. When we attribute to a movement greater competence, we tend to get it wrong. One of the interesting things about the Occupy movement is they don't even ask for us to attribute competence to them. Competence is not even a quality that is relevant. There's nothing to be competent at. They just show up. And in fact, they're being very effective in that. And yet my colleagues in the press are having a real hard time understanding that because they're looking for intentionality. They're looking for motivation. They can't deal with a movement that's made up of just people who just show up and sit there. And that's what we're going to do. They said, no, movements have to have a point. They have to have demands. This is how movements work. We know this because this is how movements have worked in the past. That's called conventional wisdom. That's not called history, it's called conventional wisdom, especially amongst my colleagues in the press who tend not to have a very deep understanding of history. They just have some dim recollection of what they read in Time Life or saw in a Ken Burns special. There's nothing against Ken Burns, but you got to go a little deeper. So conventional wisdom is the much, much more dangerous thing for us than conspiracies, actual conspiracies. There aren't any conspiracies out there. The bigger problem is conventional wisdom. And conventional wisdom grows out of this idea of reason as an identity, reasonableness. When a journalist decides that he or she is reasonable, that they're reasonable at all costs, what they tend to do is start lopping off things that seem outside the normal framework of reason. So they can't quite grasp the Occupy movement. And they can't quite deal with, even now we see the press struggling to deal with Coke money and politics. It seems so, could they really be gaming the system that much? No, no, no. The center always holds. The center of reason always holds. Now you see the conflation there. They made a mistake. They've taken the political center and conflated it with reason. And inasmuch as you are loyal to the political center, you are being reasonable. And now, suddenly, you set yourself up with some blinders, and you can't really see too much outside of that, except to dismiss it, except to show how reasonable you are by calling it conspiracy theory. I have some experience with this. In 2008, I published a book called The Family. Unfortunate subtitle, The Secret Fundamentalism at the Heart of American Power. There's a true conspiracy. Authors, I don't know about you, but we don't get to often choose our own subtitles. Publishers say, no, we know just what will sell. So it was called The Family, and it's about, I'm not going to get too much into the organization itself, but it's about the oldest and arguably most influential Christian conservative or political organization here in the United States. And it has, it's unlike a mass movement. It's made up of those whom they call key men, political elites. Goes back to 1930s, the idea that God doesn't want to work through the masses. God wants to tap, you, and you, and the rest of you can go home, and you three will take care of decisions for us, as long as you three are politicians or wealthy. Or in the military is okay too, but it's a little tacky. It's a very class-based kind of thing. And they have some very unusual ideas that have developed over the years, a kind of fetishization for strength expressed, and you can see this in one video online, the leader of the group, Doug Coe, describing his understanding of who Jesus is. He says, you know how Jesus said, you got to put me before mother, father, brother, sister? This is true. This is from Scripture, or this is truly in Scripture. Hitler, Stalin, Mao, they said the same thing. Mao even had the kids killing their own parents, but it wasn't murder, you see. This is just quotation here. It wasn't murder, you see, because it was for building the new kingdom. That's the same kind of devotion you must bring to the cause of Christ. Now, I've taken great heart from the more that quote gets around, the more conservative Christians say, no, that's not actually what we do in our church. But the more that quote gets around, it took a long, he's been doing, this is not an aberration, this is not one bad metaphor day. This is a boilerplate he's been preaching literally for decades. And you haven't heard it because this is a group that preferred not to be in the limelight. Another great quote from Doug Coe is, the more invisible you can make your organization, the more influence it will have. This is also true, which is why we have lobbying laws. But long ago, this organization decided to sidestep that. That's not a conspiracy. You've got to remember, that's not a conspiracy. We can get into the questions of why they think that's reasonable, why they experience that. They experience that idea as humility. Hey, we're just being humble as we exert massive political power behind the scenes and deny that we exist. So It's not a conspiracy. There's little conspiracies on the fringe. And when I say little conspiracies, I mean in the legal sense. That's the only way I think it really should be used. The legal sense of a couple people getting together to tell lies that are going to help cover up an illegal action. That's on the fringe. That's not the main point of the organization. It's not a conspiracy, it's a culture. It's a culture of assumptions about who holds power and who should hold power and how they should use that. So, book comes out. I'm very lucky. I get some good media right away. NBC Nightly News looks at it, is a little bit skeptical, calls the head of the organization and says, you know, what do you respond to this? The head of the organization makes a terrible mistake. He says, there is no organization. Nothing to see here. I don't know what you're talking about. Unfortunately, NBC News had done their research, and they said, well, we just, you know, been reading your tax records. You know, so that's not a conspiracy. That's just dumb. You can't. A conspiracy requires a higher level of intelligence than saying, oh, no, there's nothing here. When your tax record's there in public, there's an organization. It's got a lot of money. Money flows through. Money comes in. Money goes out. There are membership lists. There are all kinds of things, right? So NBC Nightly News puts this on. They think they've got this big story. No traction. A couple other, you know, NPR to the rescue. Diane Rehm dedicates an hour to the show, thinks it's a big story, no traction. Marketplace, no bastion of leftist conspiracy thinking. You know, right before they do the numbers, do this little story on this organization. No traction, and the story disappears. And partly it disappears because there are others who are quick to say it's a conspiracy. One of the first reviews comes from a colleague of mine in the U.S. News World Report. Says, Sharlet claims there's a conspiracy. So I write an essay. Here's page 7. This is not a conspiracy. Page 15. This is not a conspiracy. This is legal. My issue with it is not one of law breaking. My issue is one of, do we think this is the best way to do democracy? Again and again, this is a conspiracy, and we can dismiss it because he doesn't prove there's a conspiracy, because there's really only one way to prove there's a conspiracy: an envelope stuffed with cash passing hands, you know, in the night. That's what the press can understand. Anything else to speak of ideology, that's unreasonable. So the book disappears, the story disappears. And then in 2009, I get another lucky break. I should say, by the way, I happen to be a member of this organization I'm describing, partly because they're Calvinists, and this is probably not a room that says, oh yeah, Calvinists. One of the most unreasonable religious ideas is that once you're a member of the elect, you're in, no matter what. So a long time ago, I joined the group to write about it, and I'm in, no matter what. So I'm a brother. I'm a bad brother, but I'm a brother of the family. And I like to think in 2009, my brothers were sitting around saying, it's a shame what happened to Jeff's book. No one paid attention to it. What could we do to help him? And so, yeah, all right, the punchline's already there. I think you know what happened in 2009. The C Street, the title of my talk, a group of politicians all living at 133 C Street Southeast in a building registered as a church to be tax exempt, providing subsidized rent for a number of congressmen who lived under the spiritual mentorship of this organization, holding each other accountable. They were doing that by, when one of them had an affair, the others rushed to make sure no one else found out. And when campaign money gets involved, that actually probably does approach conspiracy, but I'll leave that to what is it, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington has done a great job on this. The Senate Ethics Investigation has done a good job in saying, look, you know, there really was an attempt to cover up the fact of Senator John Ensign first having an affair. Governor Mark Sanford, you know, who was at one time a presidential prospect. I think if he was in the race now, things might look different. He was a smooth talker, but instead he went to Argentina. And then the third guy, who was actually not as well known, and he really just should be, Chip Pickering. I just like saying his name, Chip Pickering. You've seen him if you saw Borat. And Borat, there's one idiot congressman from Mississippi who sort of is on the screen without comment. There needs to be no mockery of him. That's Chip Pickering, who decided to have his affair actually in the church with a lobbyist, for whom he then left Congress to go to work for a lot of money. So the press could understand this. Now we're talking about money changing hands and pans going down, and this is the kinds of things that the press can really deal with. And suddenly they were all over. But even in the midst of that, I remember I was in a room with a key player in the story, a source, and his lawyer talking to it, and they had a call from the New York Times with whom they'd also been talking. And I said, can I talk to him? You know, we're bumping up against each other in terms of covering the story. I talked to the reporter, and he sort of said, well, you know, I've got this, but I'll leave you this territory because my editors, I think this is silly, but my editors say, we're not really going to pursue the religion angle. And I said, but it's a religious organization that is covering up things for religious reasons. Yeah, we're not going to look into that. We don't want to get into that weird stuff. Conventional wisdom. Let's stay on the track of what we can understand. We don't want to mess with this strange theology, this organization, which actually experiences covering up another man's affairs and his possible misuse of campaign funds to do it. They call that accountability. They experience it as accountability, and that's important. They feel, when Senator Tom Coburn lies to help his friend Senator John Ensign, he feels it. I'm being accountable. This is the good stuff. Well, the Times doesn't want to do anything with that, and the story pretty much becomes a kind of a funny story about politicians with their pants down. There are conspiracies, actual conspiracies. There's one leader of the organization who, out of this, ends up pleading guilty to conspiracy. Former Congressman Mark Siljan, I think it was conspiracy, pled guilty to 2 charges. The Bush Justice Department, again, not usually gunning for the Christian right, said this guy had really gone too far. He was funneling money through the family's nonprofits from organizations banned as terrorist organizations because they were linked to the Sudanese regime. Funneling money through them, and in exchange he was going around on Christian right television saying that Omar al-Bashir, the first sitting head of state in history to be indicted for genocide, really melted his heart. Really a good guy. No, things had gotten out of hand, but the best way to engage him was through hugs. Seriously, hugs and also business. Hugs with some money. And so that guy got in trouble. And the press could kind of understand that a little bit, but what they couldn't understand was the real issue. Not the conspiracy, but the people who are affecting these changes legally. And here I'm sort of the last guy I want to introduce you to is Senator Jim Inhofe, who those of you who follow the climate denial story know Inhofe on that front. He is also, this is an interesting guy. He's not only anti-gay, he sort of denies the existence of homosexuality. He's famous for bringing a picture of his extended family onto the Senate floor and saying, I want to show you, there's not a single homosexual in my family. He's also famous for saying that he has a policy of not hiring homosexuals, or so he thinks. Who knows? Inhofe works with this organization family, and this is the family on something much more important than who a senator is sleeping with, on support for the East African nation of Uganda. And this is really what my last book ended up, sort of the heart of the book was being about, an initiative undertaken by the family's local branch in Uganda called the Anti-Homosexuality Bill, otherwise known as the Kill the Gays Bill. It's fairly descriptive. And the idea was to kill them all. And also, if you didn't help, you go to prison. This comes from a country, by the way, the United States has been promoting as a bastion of democracy in the region, the only African nation, I believe, to which we've given drones, and the African nation to which the Obama administration just committed 100 Special Forces troops to fight a really nasty rebel group that unfortunately barely exists anymore. That's not what this is about. So there's money, there's oil in this country, there's all this kind of stuff coming together. And here's Senator Inhofe at the heart of everything. He's doing it somewhat legally. He likes to boast that he travels to Uganda to do what he calls his Jesus thing on our dime. He's spent hundreds of thousands of dollars doing this. We pay for it. That's kind of fuzzy, but no one's pushing him on it. But the real problem is one of his proteges, a man who calls a mentor, this Ugandan legislator who came up with this Kill the Gays bill in 2009. So the bill goes on 2009, 2010, and I'm reporting on it. I'm not going to get into that story. What I want to talk here is about reason and conspiracy thinking. The trouble with reporting this story was that we had some pushback from some of our colleagues in the press. First, I was doing it with Fresh Air, and then a think tank here in Washington gathered together a lot of reporters to bring a scholar who had not been in Uganda for years to accuse me and Terry Gross of Fresh Air of getting together to promote a conspiracy theory. And I love Fresh Air, and I was honored to be on Fresh Air, but I have to admit she does not consult me on what to put on the show, on NPR. Then it gets worse. The Economist publishes a report saying that this thing had happened, but fortunately this bill is dead. It was crushed by high church Anglicans who would have none of this Pentecostal mishigas. Well, none of this is true. The bill wasn't dead. And David Bahati, the sponsor of the bill, was an Anglican who considered as another one of his mentors the Archbishop of Uganda, who happens to have a room down in the family's headquarters in Arlington called the Bishop's Room. The connections were deep. The Archbishop had said he opposed the death penalty. Everything else was okay. Life imprisonment, maybe he could work with that. But The Economist then wrote me. I wrote about this. I said, The Economist is just wrong. And they wrote me this astonishing email saying, yeah, we really appreciate this, but we're not going to publish a correction because although what we said is not true, we have it from the best people in Kampala that it will become true. Talk about making our own reality. So we're gonna stick with this. And really, frankly, also, yes, maybe there's some Anglicans involved, but we really can't believe that Anglicans would be involved in such things. That was bad enough. It continues that fall. The New Yorker comes out with a report about C Street. And the report it's kind of, it's just sort of more, it's called Frat House for Jesus, and it's kind of, look at this kind of funny thing. Don't take it too seriously. Buried in the middle is a line that a PR man for Rick Warren, who is now consulting with the family, distributes to the Ugandans. This story, he's excited about this story, says to the Ugandans, their Ugandan allies, you're going to like this. The story reports that the bill is dead and that the family helped kill it. The problem is the bill isn't dead. This is easily verifiable. You go to the Ugandan Parliament's website. You don't even have to call overseas. With the internet, we can go all the way to Africa and we can just check the bill is alive. It's still alive now. The bill was not dead. Moreover, the man who sponsored it called me up. I'd been talking to him, David Bahati, and he said, why did the New Yorker say that? And he says, he said, I've never gotten any pressure from the family over this. Never once. Now, this may be a misunderstanding between he and they, because the Americans, even Jim Inhofe, really don't want to see gay people killed. They really don't. They would like for that to go away. How much political capital they'll spend on it, I don't know. How much political capital they have to spend on it when the press is so eager to take this example of extremism and push it aside. Is it really possible that US politicians would be associated with something so monstrous? No, it is not possible, and therefore we will report it as such. There's a great sort of early example of this when I first started reporting on this for Harper's magazine, and I included Congressman Frank Wolf, who some of you may know. And is a kind of a conservative Republican, sort of well-liked by a lot of people, an amiable fellow. And he's been a part of this organization for a long time. Washington Post runs an editorial, and his opponent starts to use this. I think this is back in 2004. Washington Post runs an editorial saying that this cannot be true. And then they assign a reporter to go prove that it can't be true. The reporter goes and proves it can't be true by talking to people who say this can't be true, including people who say that I have no documentation. Reporter doesn't call me. At the time, I'm speaking at NYU Journalism School, and I said, I understand everyone has their own different journalistic practices and standards, but usually at our journalism school, we teach that when you report something about someone, you should ask them if it's true. So the Washington Post says, we'll run a correction. They run a correction. The correction says, Jeff Sharlet says that this is just not true about Frank Wolf. I said, no, that's not what I said. And I believe I may be the only person ever to have had a correction of a correction. This is not a conspiracy. The Washington Post isn't in on it. This is the dim, dull culture of conventional wisdom. And it's the culture of reason as an identity, not reason as a verb, something that we engage in, but I'm reasonable. I'm reasonable. That seems weird, that seems strange. Let's leave that out of the story. So in closing, I guess Chris sort of gave us the idea of framing. Maybe what I would contribute is to ask us to think outside of reason sometimes, to think in the language of metaphor, that those whom we find ourselves in political disagreement with are using, to understand what they mean when they say, where's the birth certificate? Because if you keep on saying, here's the birth certificate, here's a birth certificate, okay, but where's the birth certificate? As Chris pointed out, that's a kind of a dead end. So you start thinking, well, what's the metaphor here? What's the metaphor here? Now, I mean, we all can sort of leap to some easy conclusions about the metaphor of where's the birth certificate. But it's more complicated than that. It means sort of engaging with language and with self-understanding. It means engaging with an organization like the family that really cannot understand why, as a self-described invisible organization that calls itself secretive, anyone would say that they're secret. Right up to, I just did a book event in Norwich, Vermont, and afterwards it comes up, says, hi, I bring you greetings from the family. And I said, really? I teach up at Dartmouth, so that's kind of my hometown. I said, really, just enough. I'm not even, this new book has nothing to do with you. And he really thought, this guy, though, was not menacing me. He thought he could he could sit down, and I had misunderstood. 2 books, a lot of talks, a lot of TV time and so on. I had misunderstood, just like the author of the Kill the Gays bill thought I misunderstood, invited me to Kampala, says, Jeff, if you come here, you will see that why what we're doing is necessary. So that's maybe motivated reasoning. There are still conspiracy theories out there. That author of that bill said, I know why you're doing this, Jeff. You and Rachel Maddow are a gay couple. That's a conspiracy. That's a conspiracy. But I think the bigger problem is this kind of, as Chris said, motivated reasoning. I think framing is one answer. I think engaging with the language of metaphor, looking at how it is experienced. What does it feel like to say that global change, or global climate change isn't real? What does that feel like? What is that experience like? And then you can get into the story with these people. It's dark and messy in there, but you have to get there, and you can start changing the story. Thanks.